A picture-perfect world cracks. Evelyn Thatcher lived in the same suburban neighborhood she had called home for decades. The neighborhood was immaculate, a testament to her vigilance and the pride every resident took in maintaining their properties. Evelyn prided herself on being the silent guardian of this orderly haven. Her daily routine revolved around ensuring everything stayed as perfect as the day she and her late husband moved in. That crisp Tuesday morning began like any other. The sun filtered through the lace curtains of her sitting room, casting delicate patterns across her meticulously dusted coffee table. Evelyn adjusted her cardigan, grabbed her insulated thermos of herbal tea, and stepped outside. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from Mrs. Caldwell's garden across the street. Evelyn's eyes scanned her surroundings as she took her morning walk, noting every detail. The Milners had a new flagpole. How patriotic, she thought. The Fergusons' mailbox had a fresh coat of paint. Good. Standards mattered here. She turned the corner toward Oakview Park, the little green jewel of their community, smiling softly to herself as she walked. Life here was predictable, safe and orderly, just the way she liked it. The park was a hive of quiet activity. A jogger in neon shorts looped around the track, earbuds in. A mother pushed a double stroller, the wheels crunching on the gravel path. Evelyn found her favorite bench, shaded by a sycamore tree, and settled down. From here, she had the perfect vantage point to watch the world unfold. She opened her thermos and poured a steaming cup of tea, savoring the earthy aroma. The playground ahead came to life with laughter and squeals. Children chased one another, their sneakers kicking up clouds of dust. Parents dotted the benches, chatting or scrolling on their phones. Evelyn sipped her tea, smiling faintly at the idyllic scene. Then she saw them. A tall black man stood at the swings, his hand steadying a little blonde girl. She couldn't have been older than 5, her pigtails bouncing as she laughed. He smiled down at her, his face lighting up with unmistakable joy as he pushed her higher, her giggles rising above the ambient noise of the park. Evelyn's grip tightened on her thermos. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the pair. Something about the scene unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. The girl called out, "Higher, Daddy." Her voice was pure, unfiltered glee. "Daddy?" Evelyn's stomach knotted. That man, could he be her father? Her brow furrowed. The girl's fair skin and the man's dark complexion didn't match. Evelyn glanced around, searching for someone else who might be with them, but the man and the girl appeared to be alone. The man lifted the child off the swing, spinning her around as she squealed in delight. The scene should have been heartwarming, but to Evelyn, it felt wrong. Questions gnawed at her. How could he be her father? Why weren't there more people with them? Why wasn't anyone else noticing this? Evelyn shifted uncomfortably on the bench. She tried to focus on her tea, but her gaze kept snapping back to the pair. The man crouched to tie the girl's shoe, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness. The girl leaned in, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck, and he smiled as he hugged her back. Evelyn's breath hitched. It all seemed too intimate, too practiced. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Was this man her father, or was he someone pretending to be? She bit her lip, trying to reason with herself. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were just playing. Maybe he was her adoptive father or a family friend. But her unease refused to subside. What if he wasn't who he claimed to be? What if something terrible was happening right in front of her? Evelyn straightened, her pulse quickening. She had read too many stories, watched too many news reports about children abducted in broad daylight because no one acted. Her grip tightened on the thermos. She needed more information, something to confirm or allay her fears. Pretending to stretch, she leaned to the side, trying to catch more of their conversation. The girl spoke excitedly, her words too quick and jumbled for Evelyn to catch. The man laughed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed genuine. Yet her doubts persisted. "Excuse me," Evelyn called out, her voice sharp but polite. The man turned toward her, surprised. The little girl looked up, her head tilting curiously. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Evelyn offered, her tone casual but probing. The man smiled politely and nodded. "It is. And your daughter, she's adorable," Evelyn added, her words carefully chosen. "You must be so proud." His expression softened. "Thank you. She's my world." Evelyn's chest tightened. She scrutinized his face, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. Yet the nagging feeling in her gut remained. Her prejudices, long buried under the veneer of civility, whispered doubts she couldn't ignore. The man and the girl returned to their play, seemingly unfazed by the brief interaction. Evelyn watched, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. She wanted to believe everything was fine, but her imagination painted darker possibilities. What if she was witnessing a crime? What if the man was exploiting the girl's trust, using her innocence against her? Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone, her finger hovering over the screen. Should she call? What if she was wrong? But what if she wasn't? The weight of responsibility pressed down on her. She couldn't just sit here and do nothing. Finally, Evelyn made the call. Her voice quivered as she spoke to the dispatcher, giving a detailed description of the man and the child. "I think it might be a kidnapping," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Please, send someone quickly." As she ended the call, guilt pricked at the edges of her conscience. What if she had misjudged the situation? But the thought of doing nothing felt worse. She sat stiffly on the bench, her heart pounding, as the distant sound of sirens began to grow louder. The unfolding confrontation would soon ripple through the lives of everyone involved, leaving Evelyn to grapple with the fallout of her choices. But for now, she waited, the morning sun no longer warming her face but burning her with the weight of uncertainty. The collision of assumptions. Evelyn's heart thudded in her chest as the faint wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the peaceful hum of the park. She sat rigid on the bench, clutching her thermos with trembling hands. 1,000 scenarios raced through her mind, each more distressing than the last. Her gaze flicked back to the man and the little girl. They were still laughing, completely unaware of the storm about to engulf them. The first patrol car pulled into the park, its flashing lights painting the serene surroundings in harsh bursts of red and blue. A second car followed, its tires crunching over the gravel path as it came to a stop. Parkers turned their heads, their conversations halting mid-sentence. A hush fell over the playground as the officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands instinctively resting on their holsters. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Was she wrong? Doubt crept into her thoughts, but she pushed it aside. Surely, the authorities would handle this appropriately. She had done her civic duty, hadn't she? She had called to protect a child. But as she watched the officers approach the man, a new and unsettling thought surfaced. What if she had overstepped? "Sir," one officer called out, his voice sharp and commanding, "step away from the child." The man, startled, turned toward the officers. His confusion was evident as he instinctively stepped in front of the little girl, shielding her. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone measured but wary. "Hands where we can see them," another officer ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Evelyn's stomach churned. The man didn't resist, raising his hand slowly as he glanced down at the girl, his face a mask of concern. "Lily, it's okay," he murmured softly. "Just stay close." The little girl clung to his leg, her wide, tear-filled eyes darting between the officers and her father. "Daddy," she whimpered, her small voice trembling with fear. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. That one word, spoken with so much trust and love, felt like a slap to the face. Daddy. Could she have been wrong all along? One officer moved toward the man, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "We need to ask you some questions," he said, his tone flat but edged with suspicion. "Please step away from the child." "I'm her father," the man replied, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "What is this about?" "We received a report," the officer began, but the words were cut off by Lily's sudden outburst. "Leave my daddy alone," she screamed, her small hands tugging at the officer's uniform. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to wedge herself between the officer and her father. "Lily, stop," the man said gently, his voice calming despite the tension in his posture. "It's going to be okay." Evelyn stood frozen, her feet rooted to the ground. The scene unfolding before her felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. She wanted to say something, to explain, but her voice refused to cooperate. Another officer crouched down to Lily's level, his demeanor softening. "Sweetheart, we just need to make sure everything is okay," he said, his tone gentle. "Can you tell us your name?" "Lily," she shouted, her chest heaving with sobs. "And this is my daddy. Why are you being mean to him?" The officer glanced over his shoulder at his colleagues, uncertainty flickering across his face. He straightened and stepped back, lowering his hands in a gesture of de-escalation. "Let's all calm down," he said, addressing both the man and his daughter. "We're just trying to make sure she's safe." The man's patience was wearing thin. "She is safe," he said, his voice rising slightly. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The initial confidence in their approach seemed to waver as the man's words sank in. One of them spoke into his radio, requesting confirmation of the report they had received. The tension in the air was palpable, every eye in the park glued to the scene. Evelyn felt the weight of the stairs too, though no one was looking at her. A pit of dread formed in her stomach as she realized the spectacle she had set in motion. People were whispering, their hushed voices carrying snippets of speculation and judgment. "Isn't that the man who's always here with his daughter?" someone murmured. "I've seen them before," another person said. "They look happy together." Evelyn's cheeks burned. Her earlier certainty crumbled under the weight of mounting evidence that she might have made a terrible mistake. The sound of another car door slamming broke through the tension. A woman sprinted toward the scene, her face etched with panic. "Darnell! Lily!" she cried, her voice sharp with fear. The man, Darnell, turned at the sound of her voice. Relief washed over his face as he recognized her. "Jessica," he called, his tone steadying. "It's okay. We're fine." Jessica reached them in seconds, pulling Lily into her arms and then gripping Darnell's hand tightly. She turned toward the officers, her eyes blazing with fury. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "Why are you harassing my family?" One of the officers stepped forward, visibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we received a call about a possible kidnapping. We're just following up." Jessica's jaw tightened, and her eyes darted toward Evelyn, who was now trying to melt into the background. Evelyn's heart pounded as Jessica's gaze locked onto hers, filled with unmistakable fury. "Did you call?" Jessica asked, her voice sharp and accusing. "Did you assume my husband was a criminal because of the color of his skin?" Evelyn opened her mouth, but no words came out. She felt exposed, as if every flaw in her character was being laid bare. Her carefully curated life of perfection and propriety offered no shield against the raw anger in Jessica's voice. I was just trying to help," Evelyn stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought." "You thought what?" Jessica snapped, cutting her off. "That a black man with a white child had to be doing something wrong. That he couldn't possibly be her father." Evelyn flinched as if struck. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't meant any harm, but the words felt hollow even in her own mind. Jessica turned back to the officers, her voice rising. "You didn't even stop to ask questions, did you? You just assumed the worst, just like her." She jabbed a finger in Evelyn's direction. One of the officers tried to interject, his tone apologetic. "Ma'am, we're sorry for the misunderstanding." Sorry isn't good enough," Jessica snapped. "You terrified my daughter. You humiliated my husband. And all because someone made a baseless assumption." The weight of Jessica's words hung in the air, silencing the officers and leaving Evelyn reeling. She wanted to disappear, to retreat to the safety of her home and pretend none of this had happened. But there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. As the tension slowly dissipated and the officers retreated, murmuring apologies, Evelyn remained rooted to her bench. The family gathered their belongings, Jessica holding Lily close, while Darnell shot one last, piercing glance in Evelyn's direction. It wasn't anger she saw in his eyes. It was disappointment. That hurt more than any insult ever could. The family walked away, heads held high despite the ordeal. Evelyn watched them go, her heart heavy with regret. The pristine order of her world had been shattered, and she couldn't shake the sinking feeling that it was entirely her fault. The park grew quiet again, but Evelyn's thoughts were anything but. She had acted on instinct, on prejudice she had never dared to acknowledge. And now she was left to grapple with the consequences of a decision that had hurt innocent people. Evelyn remained frozen on the bench long after the family disappeared down the path, her mind racing. The reality of what she had done settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Every laugh, every tear from the girl named Lily replayed in her head, growing louder and more accusatory with each passing second. Her thermos sat forgotten in her lap, the tea inside growing cold. Around her, the park began to return to its usual rhythm. Children resumed playing on the swings and slides, their parents watching from benches and picnic tables. Yet, Evelyn's world had come to a screeching halt. She thought back to the moment she'd picked up her phone. She had been so certain that she was protecting that little girl, but as she replayed the events in her mind, every assumption she had made seemed more baseless, more driven by something she didn't want to admit to herself. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" The voice startled her. She looked up to see a young mother with a toddler balanced on her hip. The woman's face was kind, her eyes filled with concern. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. The woman waited for a moment, then gave a sympathetic smile. "Let me know if you need anything," she said gently before walking away. The interaction left Evelyn feeling even smaller. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she admit to anyone, even herself, that she had been the cause of such an unnecessary and humiliating ordeal? Her thoughts spiraled further as she sat there. She imagined the conversations that might already be happening in the neighborhood. Someone must have recognized her. Word would spread. By dinner time, everyone would know what she'd done. And then there was the family: Jessica, Darnell, and little Lily. Evelyn felt a pang of guilt so sharp it made her chest ache. She had disrupted their day, tarnished their sense of safety, and planted a memory in that child's mind that might never fade. Would Lily always remember the moment strangers treated her father like a criminal? Would she grow up wondering if the world saw her family as wrong or broken? Evelyn closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. She wasn't a bad person, was she? She had always prided herself on doing the right thing, on being a pillar of her community. Yet her actions today painted a different picture, a picture she didn't like. Finally, she stood, her legs wobbling beneath her. She needed to move, to get away from the park and its suffocating weight, but as she walked back toward her home, her shame followed her like a shadow. The streets of her neighborhood, usually her sanctuary, felt hostile now. Every friendly wave from a neighbor felt like an accusation. Every blooming flower or neatly trimmed hedge seemed mocking in its perfection, a stark contrast to the chaos she had caused. When she reached her house, she hesitated on the front steps. Her home had always been her safe place, a fortress where she could control every detail. But now it felt different, cold, uninviting, a place where she couldn't escape herself. She stepped inside and shut the door behind her, leaning against it for support. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, staring at the floor, unable to move. Eventually, she made her way to the living room and sank into her favorite armchair. The cushions, once a source of comfort, felt stiff and unyielding. Her eyes drifted to the mantel, where family photos lined the shelf. Her late husband smiled back at her from behind the glass, his eyes warm and kind. Beside him was a picture of her son as a boy, grinning with a fishing rod in hand. "What would you think of me now?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The weight of her guilt pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt truly alone. The walls of her carefully constructed world seemed to close in around her, their pristine surfaces mocking her. She thought of Jessica's words, sharp and cutting. "Did you assume my husband was a criminal because of the color of his skin?" Evelyn hadn't answered then, but the question lingered now, demanding her attention. She wanted to deny it, to insist that she hadn't acted out of prejudice. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had looked at Darnell and Lily and seen something that didn't fit into her narrow view of the world. And instead of questioning her assumptions, she had acted on them. Tears welled in her eyes as the realization hit her fully. She had failed as a neighbor, as a member of her community, and as a human being. The clock in the hallway ticked on, its rhythm steady and unyielding. Evelyn sat in the silence, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to do. The control she had always clung to had slipped through her fingers, leaving her adrift in a sea of regret. Hours passed before Evelyn finally moved. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. She stood slowly, her body stiff from sitting for so long. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but she also knew she couldn't ignore it. She walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. The neighborhood lights twinkled in the growing darkness, their warm glow a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. Evelyn took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. She didn't know how to make amends, but she knew she had to try. For her own sake, and for theirs. It was the first step on a journey she hadn't planned for, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the world she had so carefully built. Confronting the cracks, Evelyn barely slept that night. Each time she closed her eyes, images of Darnell, Jessica, and Lily replayed in her mind like a never-ending loop. Darnell's bewildered expression as officers barked orders at him. Jessica's searing words cutting through her pride. Lily's cries, filled with fear and confusion. Evelyn's chest ached as she turned restlessly in bed, clutching her quilt for comfort. But there was no comfort to be found. The morning light filtered through her curtains, but it brought no relief. Evelyn dragged herself out of bed and stood at the window, looking out at her neighborhood. The manicured lawns and freshly painted fences that once filled her with pride now felt like barriers, separating her from the people she had lived among for decades. Her actions had built those barriers, and she didn't know how to tear them down. By mid-morning, Evelyn couldn't stand the oppressive silence of her house any longer. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling from the mug. The air felt heavy with unspoken words and unanswered questions. Finally, she opened her laptop, hesitating as her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed Darnell Oakview Park into the search bar, hoping to learn more about the man she had wronged. Her stomach churned as she hit enter, unsure of what she would find. Several results popped up immediately. One was an article from the local newspaper, featuring a photo of Darnell holding Lily on his shoulders at a charity event. The headline read, "Local Father Advocates for Education Equality." Evelyn's heart sank as she clicked the link and read the article. Darnell was a teacher at a nearby high school. The piece explained. He was known for his dedication to his students and his efforts to provide resources for underprivileged kids in the community. The article highlighted a fundraiser he had organized to supply school supplies to children in need, and it featured glowing quotes from colleagues and parents praising his compassion and commitment. Evelyn sat back in her chair, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her once more. She had called the police on a man who had done nothing but love his daughter and contribute positively to the community. A man who had likely done more good in a year than she had in a lifetime. Her eyes moved to the next article, a blog post written by Jessica. The title caught her attention immediately. The subtle violence of everyday racism. Evelyn's hands trembled as she clicked the link. The post described an incident in another park, years ago, when Jessica and Darnell had been questioned by a stranger who assumed Lily wasn't their child. Jessica's words were raw and powerful, detailing the pain of being judged based on appearances and the frustration of constantly having to prove their family's legitimacy. Evelyn's throat tightened as she read Jessica's closing lines. Racism doesn't always look like hatred or slurs. Sometimes it's a glance, a question, a phone call. Sometimes it's the quiet assumption that someone doesn't belong. And those moments leave scars on us, on our children, on our society. She closed the laptop and stared at the table, her coffee untouched. Jessica's words echoed in her mind, each one a reminder of her complicity in the very thing Jessica had described. Evelyn had thought of herself as fair-minded, as someone who judged people by their character rather than their appearance. But her actions had revealed a different truth, one she could no longer ignore. The next few days passed in a haze of self-reflection and unease. Evelyn avoided the park and kept her curtains drawn, afraid of running into anyone who might recognize her. But the weight of her guilt only grew heavier with each passing hour. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't at least try to make amends. On Friday morning, she gathered her courage and wrote a letter. Her handwriting was shaky, the pen trembling in her hand as she put her thoughts to paper. She apologized for her actions, admitting that she had acted out of fear and prejudice. She acknowledged the pain she had caused and expressed her desire to make things right. Evelyn signed the letter with a heavy heart, unsure if it would even be read. She placed it in an envelope and sealed it, her hands trembling. Then she walked to her front door, pausing as she held the letter against her chest. Would this make a difference? Would it undo the harm she had caused? Probably not, she thought. But it was a start. Later that afternoon, Evelyn drove to the address she had found online for Darnell and Jessica. She parked a few houses down and sat in her car staring at the modest home. A tricycle lay on its side in the front yard, and a small chalk drawing of a rainbow decorated the driveway. Evelyn's chest tightened as she imagined Lily playing there, carefree and happy. She clutched the letter tightly as she walked up to the front door. Her palms were damp, and her heart pounded in her chest. She rang the doorbell and stepped back, her pulse quickening as she heard footsteps approaching. Jessica opened the door, her expression cautious as she looked at Evelyn. Recognition flashed in her eyes, followed quickly by a wave of guarded anger. "Can I help you?" Jessica asked, her tone cold. Evelyn's throat went dry. She held out the letter, her hands shaking. I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I needed to say I'm sorry." Jessica stared at the letter for a long moment before taking it. Her expression remained unreadable as she looked back at Evelyn. "You have no idea how much damage you caused," she said quietly, her voice trembling with restrained emotion. "To my daughter, to my husband, to our family." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I was wrong, and I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it." Jessica studied her for a moment longer, then sighed and stepped back. "I'll read your letter," she said, "but forgiveness isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn." Evelyn nodded, her head bowed. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. As Jessica closed the door, Evelyn turned and walked back to her car. The weight of her guilt hadn't lifted, but she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps in time, she could find a way to make amends. For now, all she could do was try. And she would try, with every ounce of strength she had. The ripple of regret. Evelyn sat in her car outside Darnell and Jessica's house for several minutes after delivering the letter. The sound of her heartbeat filled her ears, drowning out the chirping birds and distant hum of passing cars. She stared at her hands on the steering wheel, still trembling from the encounter. Jessica's words echoed in her mind. "Forgiveness isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn." Evelyn knew Jessica was right. A single apology couldn't undo the hurt she had caused. But where could she even begin to earn forgiveness? She started the car and drove home slowly, her thoughts heavy. As she turned into her driveway, the pristine white fence and neatly trimmed hedges felt like a mockery of her crumbling self-image. The very perfection she had worked so hard to maintain now seemed hollow. Inside, Evelyn paced her living room, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the look on Jessica's face, the mixture of pain, anger, and exhaustion. It wasn't just about what Evelyn had done. It was about the countless moments Jessica and Darnell must have faced over the years, judged and questioned by strangers who saw their family as an anomaly, or worse, a problem. Evelyn sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. The same articles she had read days earlier stared back at her, but this time, she didn't skim them. She delved deeper, reading everything she could find about Darnell and Jessica. She learned about Darnell's work as a teacher and his passion for mentoring young people, especially those from underserved communities. She read more of Jessica's blog, each post peeling back another layer of her own ignorance. Evelyn felt a pang of shame as she read Jessica's description of the exhaustion that came with being constantly scrutinized. Asterisk, it's not always outright aggression, one post read. Sometimes it's the little things, the sideways glances, the whispered comments, the assumptions. They add up, creating a weight you carry every day. The weight of Evelyn's own actions pressed down on her, and for the first time, she began to understand the depth of the harm she had caused. She couldn't change the past, but perhaps she could use it as a turning point, not just for herself, but for others as well. The next day, Evelyn took a bold step. She decided to visit the local community center, a place she had passed by countless times but never entered. The building wasn't far from her neighborhood, but it felt like a world away. She parked in the small lot and approached the front doors, her nerves prickling with unease. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Children laughed as they painted murals in one corner, while teenagers played basketball in the gym. A group of adults gathered around a table piled with books, discussing what looked like a tutoring program. Evelyn hesitated, feeling out of place in her beige cardigan and pearl necklace. A woman at the reception desk noticed her and smiled warmly. "Hello, can I help you?" she asked. Evelyn cleared her throat, her voice wavering. I was wondering if there's any way I could volunteer here. I'd like to help." The woman's smile widened. "That's wonderful. We're always looking for volunteers. What kind of work are you interested in?" Evelyn faltered. She hadn't thought that far ahead. "I'm not sure," she admitted. I want to do something meaningful." The receptionist nodded. "Why don't we start with a tour? You can see some of our programs and decide what speaks to you." Evelyn followed the woman through the center, her eyes widening as she took in the vibrant community around her. She saw children working on art projects, seniors learning how to use computers, and families picking up groceries from a small food pantry. Each room hummed with energy and purpose, a stark contrast to the rigid order of Evelyn's world. One program caught her attention in particular, a mentorship initiative for high school students. Evelyn watched as a volunteer worked with a group of teens, helping them with college applications and career planning. She thought of Darnell and the article she had read about his dedication to his students. Maybe this was where she could make a difference. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn threw herself into her new role as a volunteer mentor. At first, she felt out of her depth. The students came from diverse backgrounds, many of them facing challenges Evelyn couldn't begin to imagine. But she listened, learned, and slowly found her footing. One afternoon, as she sat with a young girl named Aisha, helping her draft a personal essay for college, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. Aisha shared her dreams of becoming a doctor, her eyes lighting up as she talked about wanting to help others. "You're going to do great things," Evelyn said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I have no doubt about that." Aisha smiled shyly. "Thanks, Mrs. Thatcher. That means a lot." For the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt a sense of purpose. She couldn't undo her past mistakes, but she could use her time and resources to support others. It was a small step, but it felt like the right one. Evelyn's efforts at the community center didn't go unnoticed. Word began to spread, and soon, her neighbors were talking, not about her mistake at the park, but about the changes she was making. Some were skeptical, while others were impressed. Evelyn didn't care about their opinions. She wasn't doing this for validation. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do. One day, as Evelyn was leaving the community center, she saw a familiar face in the parking lot. Jessica stood by her car, holding a stack of flyers. Evelyn froze, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected to see Jessica here, and she wasn't sure how to approach her. Jessica noticed Evelyn and raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Thatcher," she said, her tone neutral. Evelyn swallowed hard and stepped forward. "Jessica," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know you volunteered here." Jessica glanced at the flyers in her hand. "I run a program here for parents," she said. "Workshops on navigating the education system, advocating for their kids, that sort of thing." "That's wonderful," Evelyn said softly. I've been volunteering here too, with the mentorship program." Jessica studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Why?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "Because I made a mistake," she admitted. "A terrible mistake, and I want to do better. Not just for myself, but for others. I can't change what happened, but I can try to make amends." Jessica's gaze softened, though her guardedness didn't fully disappear. "Words are easy," she said. "Actions are harder." "I know," Evelyn said. "And I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm trying." Jessica nodded slowly. "Keep trying," she said, "for the right reasons." As Jessica walked away, Evelyn felt a mix of relief and resolve. She had a long road ahead of her, but she was determined to walk it. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. Evelyn stood in the parking lot long after Jessica had walked away, her heart still pounding from the conversation. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but Jessica's words had carried a faint glimmer of something Evelyn hadn't dared hope for: acknowledgement. Jessica had seen her efforts, and while she hadn't embraced Evelyn's apology, she hadn't rejected it outright either. It was enough to fuel Evelyn's determination. She returned home that evening with a new sense of purpose, her steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. The silence of her house no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like a space where she could plan her next steps. She opened her notebook, a habit she'd started recently, and jotted down her thoughts. Continue volunteering at the community center. Research more about racial bias and privilege. Find ways to support families like Jessica and Darnell's in meaningful ways. Evelyn paused, her pen hovering over the page. For years, she had lived in a bubble, believing her life was the gold standard of normalcy. But now she saw the cracks in that belief. She had so much to learn, so much to unlearn. The next week, Evelyn decided to attend one of Jessica's workshops at the community center. The flyer on the bulletin board described it as a session for parents on advocating for their children in school systems. Evelyn wasn't a parent, but she felt it was an opportunity to listen and learn from Jessica and the family she worked with. The room was modest, but filled with warmth. Parents of all ages and backgrounds sat in folding chairs, their expressions a mix of curiosity and determination. Evelyn slipped into a chair at the back, hoping to go unnoticed. She clutched her notebook tightly, ready to take in every word. Jessica stood at the front, her presence commanding yet approachable. She began by introducing herself and sharing her story. Evelyn had already read parts of it on Jessica's blog, but hearing it in person was different. Jessica's voice carried the weight of experience, her words resonating deeply. "We all want the best for our kids," Jessica said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But sometimes the systems in place aren't designed with all of us in mind. That's why it's so important to advocate, to speak up when something doesn't feel right. Evelyn found herself nodding along, her heart heavy with the realization of how many families faced obstacles she had never even considered. Jessica spoke about the challenges of racial bias in schools, the importance of representation, and the power of community. The parents in the room shared their stories, each one a testament to resilience and love. At the end of the session, Jessica opened the floor for questions. Evelyn hesitated, unsure if it was her place to speak. But as the room fell silent, she raised her hand tentatively. Jessica's eyes landed on her, and Evelyn felt the weight of the room's attention. "Yes," Jessica said, her tone measured. "I'm not a parent," Evelyn began, her voice shaky. "But I want to learn. I want to understand how to be a better ally, how to support families like yours. Is there a place for someone like me in this work?" Jessica studied her for a moment, her expression thoughtful. The room was silent, everyone waiting for her response. Finally, she nodded. "There's always room for someone willing to listen and learn," she said. "But it's not about being the savior. It's about showing up, doing the work, and amplifying the voices that need to be heard." Evelyn nodded, her cheeks flushed. "Thank you," she said softly. After the session, Evelyn lingered, unsure if she should approach Jessica. She wanted to thank her for the opportunity to attend, but she also didn't want to overstep. As she gathered her things, Jessica approached her instead. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Jessica asked, her arms crossed, but her tone less guarded than before. "I am," Evelyn said. "I know I've made mistakes, and I can't undo them, but I want to do better. I want to be better." Jessica nodded slowly. "Then keep coming. Keep learning. And don't expect it to be easy." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I don't expect it to be." Jessica extended her hand. "Thank you for showing up. That's the first step." Evelyn shook her hand, a small but meaningful gesture that felt like the start of something important. As she left the community center that evening, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she felt she was on the right path. The weeks turned into months, and Evelyn became a regular fixture at the community center. She attended more workshops, joined discussions on systemic bias, and worked closely with the mentorship program. Her circle expanded as she connected with people from all walks of life, each one teaching her something new. One afternoon, as she was organizing a college prep session for the mentorship program, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Thatcher." Evelyn turned to see Darnell standing in the doorway, holding Lily's hand. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him since the day at the park, and she wasn't sure how he would react to her presence. "Darnell," she said, her voice steady but nervous. "It's good to see you." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Jessica told me you've been volunteering here." "I have," Evelyn said. I'm trying to learn, to make amends." Darnell studied her for a moment, then looked down at Lily. "This is the lady from the park," he said gently. Lily looked up at Evelyn, her eyes curious. "You made my daddy cry," she said bluntly. Evelyn's chest tightened, but she knelt down to Lily's level. "I did," she said softly. "And I'm so sorry. I was wrong, and I hurt you and your daddy. I'm trying to be better." Lily tilted her head, considering Evelyn's words. Then she looked up at Darnell. "Daddy, can we go to the swings now?" Darnell chuckled softly and nodded. "Sure, sweetheart." As they turned to leave, Darnell glanced back at Evelyn. "Actions speak louder than words," he said. "Keep doing the work." "I will," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "Thank you for giving me a chance." Darnell nodded, and Evelyn watched as he and Lily walked away, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and determination. She wasn't there yet. She might never fully make up for her mistake, but she was moving forward, and that was what mattered most. The ripple effect. Evelyn's transformation didn't go unnoticed. Her once isolated presence in the neighborhood had begun to shift. Neighbors who had previously exchanged polite waves now stopped to talk to her, some curious, others skeptical. It wasn't just her increased involvement in the community center that caught their attention. It was the visible change in her demeanor. The sharp, judgmental edge she once carried had softened, replaced by a quiet humility. One Saturday morning, Evelyn stood in her driveway, watering the begonias she had planted along the edge of her lawn. A neighbor, Clara Bennett, strolled over, her young son toddling at her side. Clara was relatively new to the area, and Evelyn hadn't spoken to her much beyond a few casual greetings. "Morning, Evelyn," Clara said with a smile. "I heard you've been volunteering at the community center." Evelyn turned off the hose and wiped her hands on a towel. "I have," she replied, a little hesitantly. "It's been eye-opening, to say the least." Clara nodded, her smile fading into something more thoughtful. "I've been meaning to ask, what made you decide to get involved? You've been living here for so long, but it's like you've become a different person these past few months." Evelyn hesitated, her gaze dropping to the flowers at her feet. The question wasn't easy to answer, but she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. "I made a mistake," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "A terrible one. I acted out of fear and prejudice, and I hurt a family that didn't deserve it. Volunteering. It's my way of trying to do better." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "That's honest," she said after a pause. "And brave. Most people wouldn't admit something like that." "It's not bravery," Evelyn replied, shaking her head. "It's necessity. I don't think I could live with myself if I didn't try to make things right." Clara nodded slowly. "Well, for what it's worth, I think it's admirable. And if there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Evelyn smiled faintly, touched by the offer. "Thank you, Clara. That means a lot." As Clara walked away, Evelyn felt a small spark of hope. Conversations like this, while difficult, were steps toward rebuilding trust, not just with others, but with herself. At the community center, Evelyn had begun to take on more responsibilities. She was no longer just a participant in programs. She was an advocate. She helped organize events, facilitated discussions, and even brought in guest speakers to talk about topics like unconscious bias and systemic inequality. Each day was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity to grow. One afternoon, Evelyn sat with a group of high school students, helping them prepare for an upcoming debate competition. The topic was the role of community in combating injustice. As the students brainstormed ideas, Evelyn listened intently, occasionally offering suggestions. One student, a boy named Jamal, turned to her and asked, "Mrs. Thatcher, what made you want to get involved in all this? Most people your age aren't exactly worried about stuff like this." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Let's just say I've learned a lot about myself recently," she said, "and I realized I had been part of the problem. I'm trying to change that." Jamal nodded thoughtfully. "It's cool that you're doing this. A lot of people wouldn't bother." "It's not about being cool," Evelyn replied. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." The students nodded, their expressions thoughtful as they returned to their discussion. Evelyn watched them, a sense of quiet pride swelling in her chest. These kids were the future, and she was grateful for the chance to support them in even a small way. As weeks turned into months, Evelyn's connection to the community deepened. She began collaborating with Jessica on workshops, helping to organize events that brought together families from different backgrounds. Their partnership wasn't without its challenges. Jessica still held a guardedness that Evelyn couldn't blame her for, but they had found common ground in their shared desire to make the community a better place. One evening, Evelyn and Jessica sat in the community center's office, finalizing plans for a neighborhood festival. The event was designed to celebrate diversity, with food, music, and activities from different cultures. "This is going to be amazing," Jessica said, scanning the list of vendors and performers. "I'm glad you're helping with this." "So am I," Evelyn replied. "It feels good to be part of something bigger than myself." Jessica glanced at her, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You've come a long way, Evelyn." Evelyn met her gaze, her own smile tinged with sadness. "I still have a long way to go," she said. "But thank you. That means more than you know." Jessica nodded, her expression softening. "Just keep showing up. That's what matters." The festival was a resounding success. Families from all over the neighborhood gathered at the park, laughing, eating, and enjoying the vibrant atmosphere. Evelyn stood near the entrance, greeting attendees and handing out programs. She watched as children ran from booth to booth, their laughter filling the air. At one point, she spotted Darnell and Lily in the crowd. Lily was holding a balloon shaped like a unicorn, her face alight with joy. Darnell caught Evelyn's eye and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something, a sign that her efforts were being noticed. Later that evening, as the festival wound down, Evelyn found herself sitting on a bench, watching the last few families pack up and head home. Jessica joined her, a tired but satisfied smile on her face. "You did good today," Jessica said, her voice warm. "We all did," Evelyn replied. "This wouldn't have happened without you." Jessica shook her head. "It wouldn't have happened without us. That's the point, isn't it? Community isn't about one person fixing everything. It's about all of us working together." Evelyn nodded, her heart full. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged, not because of her past, but because of her present. And she knew she would carry that sense of purpose with her, wherever this journey led. Healing through action. The weeks following the festival brought an air of quiet change to Evelyn's life. Though she still felt the weight of her mistakes, she was beginning to see the impact of her efforts. The community center had become a second home, a place where she could contribute meaningfully, learn from others, and confront the biases that had once governed her actions. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't even close, but it was progress. On a breezy Saturday morning, Evelyn found herself back at Oakview Park, the site of the confrontation that had set her journey in motion. She hadn't been there since that day, and stepping onto the familiar grounds brought a flood of emotions. The laughter of children echoed through the air, and parents sat on benches, chatting and watching their kids play. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated. The memory of her actions lingered like a shadow, but she pushed forward, clutching a tote bag filled with books. She was here for a purpose. At the far end of the park, a small group of children had gathered under a large oak tree for the weekly storytime session organized by the community center. Evelyn had volunteered to lead the session, a task she approached with a mix of excitement and nervousness. As she approached, she spotted Jessica and Lily sitting among the children. Jessica caught her eye and offered a brief smile, an acknowledgement of Evelyn's persistence. Lily waved enthusiastically, her unicorn balloon from the festival tied to her wrist. Evelyn's heart lifted at the sight. She set down her tote bag and greeted the group. "Good morning, everyone. Are you ready for some stories?" The children cheered, their excitement infectious. Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a colorful picture book. She began to read, her voice animated as she brought the story to life. The children leaned forward, their eyes wide with interest. As she read, Evelyn noticed Lily glancing up at her with a curious expression. When the story ended, Lily raised her hand. "Can I ask you a question, Mrs. Thatcher?" she said, her voice small but confident. Evelyn nodded, kneeling down to Lily's level. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Lily hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Why were you so scared of my daddy that day?" The question, simple and direct, hit Evelyn like a jolt. She glanced at Jessica, who watched silently but didn't intervene. This was Evelyn's moment to answer honestly. Evelyn took a deep breath. "Lily, that day I made a mistake. A very big mistake," she said gently. "I let my fear and my wrong ideas about people make me do something hurtful. It wasn't fair to your daddy, or to you, and I'm so sorry." Lily tilted her head, her brows furrowing. But you're not scared of him now? No, Evelyn said firmly. I've learned a lot since then. Your daddy is a wonderful man, and I'm lucky to know him. Lily seemed to consider this for a moment, then smiled. Okay, she said simply, as if her acceptance carried all the weight of the world. Jessica's expression softened, and she gave Evelyn a small nod of approval. It wasn't an absolution, but it was a step, a bridge being built, one plank at a time. As the storytime session wrapped up, Evelyn stayed behind to pack up the books and tidy the area. To her surprise, Jessica approached, holding 2 cups of coffee from a nearby vendor. Thought you might need this, Jessica said, handing her one of the cups. Evelyn accepted it gratefully. Thank you. They sat together on a bench, watching the children play. The silence between them was comfortable, the tension that had once defined their interactions slowly dissolving. You're really putting in the work, Jessica said after a while. I wasn't sure you'd stick with it. Evelyn smiled faintly. Neither was I, she admitted, but it's not something I can walk away from. Not after what I've learned. Jessica nodded, her gaze distant. You know, it's not just about what happened that day, she said. It's about all the days before and all the days after. It's about changing the way people think, not just for the moment, but for the future. I know, Evelyn said, and I want to be part of that change, however small my role might be. Jessica studied her for a moment, then smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine. I think you already are. In the months that followed, Evelyn's involvement in the community deepened. She co-organized workshops, helped expand the mentorship program, and even started a book club focused on literature that explored themes of diversity, equality, and empathy. The club became a hit, drawing members from all over the neighborhood. Evelyn also began working closely with Darnell, who initially approached her with a degree of caution, but eventually came to respect her commitment. Together, they developed a program to support young teachers in creating inclusive classrooms. Evelyn's experience and organizational skills complemented Darnell's passion and expertise, and their collaboration became a cornerstone of the community center's offerings. One day, as Evelyn walked through the community center, she passed a bulletin board covered with photos from recent events. She paused, her eyes landing on a picture of herself sitting with a group of students during a mentorship session. She barely recognized the woman in the photo, not because of her appearance, but because of the change within her. The woman in the photo wasn't the Evelyn who had once sat on a park bench, clutching a thermos and letting her fears dictate her actions. This Evelyn was different, wiser, humbler, and deeply committed to growth. She wasn't perfect, and she never would be, but she had learned that perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was progress, and that was something she could strive for every day. As she turned to leave, Evelyn spotted Jessica and Darnell across the room, deep in conversation. Lily ran up to them, holding a drawing she had made, and they both crouched down to admire it. Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wasn't just a spectator anymore. She was part of something bigger, a community built on understanding, resilience, and hope. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt at peace, not because she had absolved herself, but because she had found a way to move forward. Through her actions, she was healing, not just herself, but the community she had once hurt. And that, she realized, was the truest form of redemption she could hope for.